lucky to be joined right now by Brandon Arnold, the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for the kind words about NTU.
Oh, you guys do such great work. And there's so few people these days that seem to care about how taxpayers' money is being spent. But you guys have been there for a long time, defending it and highlighting it and trying to make a situation better for everyday taxpayers. There is a great moment ahead of us. If there's a judgment day, it's just a few weeks off, I guess, a real opportunity for Congress to change the arc of spending with the debt deal. The Democrats want to keep spending. They want to just double the size of an credit card. Republicans want to shrink it. Tell us where we are at this moment. How do you handicap where both sides enter into the final negotiations?
Well, for the first time in literally months, we're actually seeing some signs of progress and some reasons for optimism, because McCarthy, along with Schumer, Biden, and all of their surrogates, have begun to make a little bit of progress. We don't know a lot about the contents of that deal, but what is leaked out are some positive reforms. Now, listen, if you and I are sitting around the negotiating table, we're going to produce a much different deal, of course, than what's going to come out of these conversations. But I think we will actually get a little bit of deficit reduction, legitimate deficit reduction. And I'm not sure I would have said that with a great deal of confidence even a week ago.
Yeah, I think the last meeting showed, the weekend and the last meeting on Tuesday, I think showed that Joe Biden knows he's got to do a deal. Now, there's a change in dynamics. I've lived through several of these debt cliffs here in Washington, and the Republicans are always the last minute. Here's our solution. And the Democrats already had demagogued them and cornered them. This time, Republicans are out front. It's the Democrats that are being asked, where's your plan? What are you going to do? How important was it for Kevin McCarthy to flip around and end up having the upper hand in negotiations by having something that's kind of quite popular with the American public?
Yeah, that was huge. It's been over 3 weeks now since they passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act. It's a very good bill, trillions of dollars of debt reduction, deficit reduction over the next 10 years. Not a perfect bill, but it's a great bill. But what it did, as you kind of allude to there, is it changed the dynamics of these negotiations. The House of Representatives is the entity that has put forward and passed a plan. Schumer didn't even introduce a clean debt ceiling proposal until May 1st. Well after the Republicans in the House had passed their plan. Biden has pounded the table and demanded a clean debt bill, but he hasn't actually started to turn the wheels of action on Capitol Hill. And Democrats, well, they just got out of the gates with their discharge petition, a real Hail Mary strategy that isn't going anywhere, particularly this late in the game. Democrats were caught doing basically nothing. They were caught flat-footed because they didn't think McCarthy could get a bill through the House of Representatives. They didn't think he could get his moderates and his more conservative members on board on the same package, and he proved everybody wrong to his credit. Yeah,
it really is remarkable. And with a 4-vote margin, there's very little room for missing, and he seems to keep threading the needle. And there's an unusual unanimity in the caucus that I haven't seen in a long time. Maybe the beginning of the Newt Gingrich era back in 94, 95. There was some of this, but it's really stunning that sort of everyone has different opinions, but they all are content. They're all intent on working to get them resolved and get the best deal that everyone can sign off on. Everyone seems to have a seat at the table, and that really has some pretty important stuff. Where do you see debate talks go next? Well, I mean, obviously the president's overseas. He's going to cut that trip short, apparently. That's a sign that he wants to negotiate more. What do you think are the next crucial signs we should be watching for, and where is the compromise likely to fall?
Yeah, I think heading into next legislative week, I think that's when we're going to probably see a package really start to come together. Not just an agreement in principle, but legislative text start to be pieced together, then to start to write a bill. The Senate is out next week. The Senate is in recess next week. So Schumer is in all likelihood going to have to bring those members back from states all across the country to vote the latter part, I'm guessing, the latter part of next week. The House, I'm hopeful, again, a lot of this is speculation, I'm hopeful the House will pass something early next week, maybe the middle of next week. Now, of course, all of that requires things to come together, the stars to align and so forth. But based on what I'm hearing from Capitol Hill and based on the news reports that are coming out to the public, it does look like we are getting closer to that point. And that's really clear. You know, even if we get really close to the X date, which is supposedly June 1 without crossing it, markets are going to get very skittish. we are going to start to see some activity taking place in financial markets that we don't fear level and stress level rises and rises.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. It really is an interesting moment. And obviously, Senate being out changes the dynamic a little bit. I guess they could schedule something quickly if they had to. As you look out over the horizon over the next few weeks, there's a lot of things that I think Americans are still educating themselves on. And one of them is we got used to free money, right? We got used to interest rates being so low that borrowing really didn't have much of a consequence to it. But now the interest rates are going up to slow down, or in an effort to slow down stubborn inflation. And that means the debt service of the United States government is just becoming double, triple more used to be. How important is it that we may soon have $1 trillion in debt service payments, which would be more than we used to spend on the entire military budget?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting to that point. We're, I think in 2022, $475 billion in interest payments just to service the debt, nearly $500 billion. And those are big numbers. To put that in context, that's far larger than the entire GDP of the country of Denmark, of Egypt, of South Africa, right around where Austria is. And we're going to be above that $500 billion mark this year, regardless of what happens in these debt negotiations. So that's only going to go up unless we do something about it in a very serious manner, because every dollar that we're borrowing today, the debt service payments are more expensive than they were a couple of years ago when inflation was very, very low, interest was very, very low. Now that interest rates are creeping up, it becomes more and more expensive. We're hitting that debt spiral issue where we just can't even keep up with our interest payments, and they begin to crowd out important services, important functions of government, and those necessitate tax increases. Tax increases slow down economic growth, require more debt. So, it keeps snowballing and snowballing unless we do something about it. And that's what really frustrates me when you hear people say, oh, let's touch this program, but not that program. Let's deal with domestic discretionary spending, but let's leave entitlements alone, for instance. You hear that a lot, even from Republicans.
We do, right? Yeah.
But what do we do when those trust funds get exhausted? We're looking at exhausting the Medicare trust fund in a few years, Social Security trust fund in 10 years. If we wait into that point, it becomes much, much more difficult to take action to fix those imbalances. You're looking at big benefit cuts. You're looking at huge tax increases. All of these things that we don't want to do. It's much better to fix the problem now.
Yeah. Such a great point. I mean, we're larding, particularly with current interest rates, we're larding even more burden on future generations of Americans if we don't start to haul this in. And when the debt service payment, the interest rate payments that the government exceeds some countries' GDP at warning sign. I think we exceed the current GDP of Denmark. That's a warning sign, I think, to most Americans. As you look out now, there are some other things that I think Americans are looking to prioritize, because right after they finish the debt ceiling, they got to get to the first budget of the Republican Congress, and maybe the first budget that Congress has formally passed in a very, very long time. There seems to be some high priorities. Revising permitting, it seems like there's some bipartisan agreement that permitting has gotten out of control and it's slowing down economic growth and common sense. There seems to be some bipartisan agreement, though maybe not from the White House yet, that recovering COVID funds that weren't spent when we're no longer in the pandemic, that makes some sense. And then there's the tougher one of where to cut spending. All three of those are big opportunities for Republicans to put an imprimatur on the government. What is your wish list? When you look at that, what does NTU go out and say, you know what? Here are some things that are low-hanging fruit you could get through. Even Democrats would say, that's a good idea.
Yeah, it's few and far between, unfortunately, because every spending program has a beneficiary in Washington that has a team of lobbyists working to preserve those funds and keep them in the federal budget, unfortunately. But I do think there is some progress, some potential for progress on areas like permitting reform. And what we're seeing now, Republicans have been complaining about this for years and years. We can't develop energy projects. We can't build infrastructure, all because of these environmental review processes. And listen, I don't think we should be building things in sensitive environmental areas, of course, but we shouldn't have a review process that takes 10 years or longer. That just doesn't make sense. These review processes need to happen more efficiently and on a reasonable timeline. Now, what's happened lately is Democrats have started to get frustrated with this because they've spent so much money to too much money, if you ask me, on alternative energy projects. And we saw that to a great extent with the Inflation Reduction Act, more than $1 trillion in energy tax energy projects. And we saw that to a great extent with the Inflation Reduction Act, more than $1 trillion in energy tax credits, trying to build, solar, wind, other types of renewable energy. Well, that's all well and good, but those have to go through the same permitting processes as a natural gas plant would, or the transmission lines to carry the energy from that new renewable facility to the grid. Those have to go through the same permitting processes. So all of a sudden, they're getting just as frustrated as Republicans who have wanted energy independence and more domestic production for decades, because they can't get their pet projects built. So I think reasonable people are starting to see that these processes are just simply broken. They're not achieving their desired gains, and they're just basically acting as a huge brake on our economy. And hopefully there is some progress there. It's not something that I personally think should be included in the debt ceiling, because I think that should be just laser focused on our debt and deficit problem. But it is something that's really, really important to our economy and to our nation's financial well-being, as well as our national security, of course.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is a lot of, I think, recognition in the American people that we're not on a sustainable future, that we just can't keep spending this way, that $5 trillion of tax revenue seem to be plenty to live on, and yet we seem to exceed it. Will this become an issue like it did in the 94 election? Will this become an issue that's actually palpable in the polls, that people are actually saying it's time to get our financial house in order? I think a lot of people feel like this might be the first election in a long time that this becomes a measurable, movable issue in the election.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, John. And I was actually up in New Hampshire earlier this week, and no, I'm not running for president. That's what you're going to ask me.
Yeah, you always have to say that when you mention New Hampshire. That's funny.
Exactly. I was up there, and I was talking to people, and I asked a number of people, what is the biggest issue that you are concerned about right now? What is the one that you are watching these members of Congress or governors or whomever as they're coming through New Hampshire? What do you want to hear from them? And every single person I asked brought up the national debt. And I thought that was a real rarity.
That's amazing.
So often you hear, border security, energy, Second Amendment issues, whatever. But I heard so many people talking about the debt. And I think one of the very few silver linings in the pandemic has been people appreciate more than ever the need for financial responsibility, fiscal responsibility from the government, because we saw such reckless spending, trillions and trillions of dollars like our nation had never seen before. And what were the result of that? Sure, some of it was helpful. Some of it helped prop up small businesses and kept individuals able to pay their mortgage and so forth. But we spent way too much. Everybody knows that. And the inflation, the ensuing inflation, runaway inflation, was directly connected in the minds of voters to that excessive spending. And now they want to see it undone. So I think you're right. I think this is going to be a bigger issue than it has been for decades, probably going back to the 90s when we actually did see Republicans and Democrats working together. We saw actually bipartisan a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution. We actually saw a balanced budget overall in the early 2000s. I'm hopeful. Maybe I'm being too optimistic to the point of naivety, but I'm hopeful that we are starting to turn the tide and get back to those types of conversations.
Yeah, I think that is a good hopefulness. I think there's reason to see in the polling data and just in talking to voters, they understand that we've become unsustainable in our spending patterns. And I think they want to fix that, not leave that for another generation to fix. So it's a fascinating time. Brandon, it's always an honor to have you and anyone from NTU on. Just real quickly for our audience, what's the best way for people to stay in touch with all the great work that NTU does?
Well, we're, of course, on the web, ntu.org, National Taxpayers Union. You can find us on Twitter, find us on Facebook, all over social media. Please check us out. We'd love to have you reading our articles, commenting on articles, and of course, supporting our organization.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. All right. Well, folks, go check that out. It's very easy to remember. NTU, nationaltaxpayersunion.org. Very easy to find. A valuable resource. As a journalist, I check it often because we learn so much, and there's no one more serious about the state of America's fiscal health than what NTU does every day. So go check them out. Brandon, great to have you on. I know we're going to need you on real soon. This is not going away anytime in the near future.
Anytime, John. Thank you so much.
All right, folks, that wraps up the Friday edition of John Solomon Reports, the podcast from Just the News. So grateful you can join us. A big thank you to all of our guests. We've had some great ones this week. Still thinking about the interview I did a couple days ago with Congressman Bill Post.